Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. What is a counterfactual? It is a kind of analysis where we examine what might have happened had historical events gone differently. This is a series of podcasts that dwell on that eternal question. What if? I'm Josh, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. Joining me is the History Guy himself and friend of the History Guy, Brad Wagnon. If you'd like to support us, you can find us on Patreon, YouTube, and locals.com. On today's episode, we talk about a pivotal battle in a poorly remembered war, the Battle of Paardeburg in the Second Anglo-Boer War. The war would consolidate all of South Africa under British Colonial rule and radically transform the Canadian military. But what if it didn't? Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
This is a type of cap that's commonly used in the British Army and armies of the British Commonwealth. That's sometimes referred to as a barracks cap or a forage cap because they were originally used for informal duties, and also sometimes called a peak cap because this piece here, which Americans would usually call a visor or a brim, the British refer to as a peak. This hat's from the 1980s, and actually these hats are going out of style. They're largely being replaced with berets. But one of the things that I like about these regimental caps is that while the designs are fairly similar, different regiments would use different colors or different piping, and they would all have a different cap badge on the front that represents their regiment. And as the regiments of the British Army and the former Commonwealth usually have long and storied histories, that means that each of these caps and each of these badges represents a unique window into history, and that is certainly true of this particular hat. On this badge is an 8-pointed diamond-cut star, with the star in a raised circle surmounted by a crown, and on the circle are the block letters V-R-I. Those letters are actually called an imperial cipher, which is, in essence, a monogram for a ruling monarch. What is odd about this badge, though, is that the cipher is outdated. A royal or imperial cipher is usually updated for the current monarch, but instead of the cipher for the current monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, VRI stands for Victoria Regina Imperatrix, meaning Victoria, Queen and Empress. So while this hat is from the 1980s, it bears a royal cipher from Queen Victoria, who died in 1901. And that actually tells us all we need to know where this hat comes from. Because while there were many regiments who were authorized to use the royal cipher in their badge, there was only one regiment in all of the empire that was authorized to continue to use Victoria's royal cipher in perpetuity. And that unique privilege, surprisingly, didn't go to a regiment of the British Army, but a regiment from one of the Dominions. This hat represents the Royal Canadian Regiment. The Royal Canadian Regiment was formed in 1883 as an infantry school corps designed to train the Canadian militia. And while they have a long and storied history, there is a particular battle and conflict that defined not just the reputation of the Royal Canadian Regiment, but the reputation of the Canadian Army in general. Britain fought numerous wars in the Victorian era as the island nation maintained the largest empire in history. And men of Canada serving in British regiments participated in those conflicts throughout the era. But it was at the very end of the Victorian era and the very beginning of the 20th century that Great Britain faced a colonial war so challenging that it required deploying a substantial amount of troops from its dominions outside their own borders. The Second Anglo-Boer War began in 1899 after long-standing tensions between the British and the two Dutch Boer republics in South Africa culminated in the Boers declaring war. The British government suggested that Canada provide troops for the conflict that would be absorbed into British units. At the time, the Canadian Army, or what was called the Permanent Force, was tiny, and the Royal Canadian Regiment of Infantry was the only infantry regiment of the Permanent Force. A wave of enthusiasm in English Canada allowed for strong recruitment of a force of some 1,000 that had a corps of professional troops from the Permanent Force, augmented by volunteers. But the Canadian government wanted these troops to have a truly Canadian identity, and so instead of parceling them out to different British units, they were formed into a single battalion that was designated the 2nd Special Service Battalion of the Royal Canadian Regiment of Infantry. The Second Anglo-Boer War was the first time that Canadians in Canadian uniforms fighting in a Canadian unit made war overseas. The battalion arrived in South Africa on November 29th of 1899 into what had already become a bloody conflict. At the outset, the outnumbered British forces in Natal and Cape Colony were quickly surrounded and besieged, but it had been generally expected that a quickly mobilized army corps under General Redvers Buller would soon overcome the Boers. But the British were using outdated tactics that had been developed in the colonial wars of the past. British generals failed to comprehend the impact of destructive fire from trench positions and the mobility of cavalry raids. The day before the Canadian battalion had arrived, the British had won a nominal victory, forcing the Boers to withdraw at the Battle of Modder River. While the British had managed to flank the Boers and force them to withdraw, the British had learned a brutal lesson in what the force's commander called one of the hardest and most trying fights in the annals of the British Army, after the British troops spent much of their time pinned to the ground, tortured by heat and thirst, unable to move as there was no cover from the Boers' deadly accurate fire. It was clear that the tactic of frontal attack by infantry only, that had succeeded so often against colonial opponents, was effectively impossible against an entrenched army using bolt-action rifles. It was a lesson that the British were slow to learn. As the Canadian battalion spent a couple of months on line of communication duties, which was a critical time for the Canadians to train since they were largely inexperienced, the British Army suffered a string of devastating defeats at the hands of the Boer commandos. Between December 10th and 15th, the Boers had won 3 lopsided and bloody victories against Buller's armies at the battles of Stormberg, Magersfontein, and Colenso. British losses had been so terrible that British press called the brutal time the Black Week. On February 12, 1900, the men of the Royal Canadian Regiment of Infantry joined the 19th Brigade as part of a large British offensive intended to capture Pretoria, the capital of the Boer state of Transvaal. 6 days later, the Canadians would experience the full terror of what some have called the First Modern War at the Battle of Paardeberg. The new invasion force threatened the flank of a Boer force under the command of Piet Cronje that had won the victory at the Battle of Magersfontein in December. Cronje's force of some 4,500 Boers, hampered by a slow-moving supply train, was trying to withdraw when it was blocked at a crossing of the Modder River by British cavalry, allowing a 15,000-man force under the command of Lieutenant General Horatio Kitchener to surround them. The Boers entrenched themselves at a place called Paardeberg, which in the Boer Afrikaans language means Horse Hill. The situation was dire for Cronje, as the British had overwhelming artillery and could bombard his commando into submission. But Kitchener, who had gained fame fighting dervishes in the Mahdist Wars, and whom had been worried about Boer reinforcements, instead ordered frontal attacks on Cronje's prepared position, despite the lessons from the failure of those tactics in December. The attacks occurred on Sunday, February 18, 1900. One of the 2 regiments to lead those attacks were the Royal Canadians. The position was terrible. The Canadian troops, exhausted already from a long march, first had to make a difficult crossing of the Modder River. As one private noted, "We had quite a time crossing, as the water was up to our chins and the current very strong." Once across, they formed for the attack. The land sloped down to the Boer position for over 800 yards with no cover. The Boers opened a devastating fire at about 100 yards. The attack was stymied, and the troops that weren't immediately killed were pinned down by fire until they could retreat under the cover of night. Kitchener's force took over 1,100 casualties that day, the single greatest loss of life for Imperial forces in the Second Boer War. 78 of the killed and wounded were from the Royal Canadians. That day became known as Bloody Sunday. For 8 days, the British shelled the Boer position. While this caused few casualties among the entrenched Boer fighters, it destroyed their wagons and killed their horses and mules. Cronje's Boers were becoming increasingly demoralized. But it was the Canadians who would break the stalemate. The Royal Canadians were ordered to another assault on February 27th, again taking terrible losses. But instead of withdrawing in the night as before, with the help of the Royal Engineers, they dug trench lines that night, less than 65 yards from the Boer positions. In the morning, the Boers found themselves looking down the barrels of the rifles of the entrenched Canadians. Realizing that his position was hopeless, Cronje surrendered. It was the first significant British victory and a clear turning point in the Second Anglo-Boer War. The 4,000 or so Boers that were taken into captivity represented nearly 10% of the Boer army, and the victory played a huge role in the morale of both armies and the eventual defeat of the Boer armies in the field. But it was also a turning point for the Canadians, who received a great deal of the credit for the victory. Field Marshal Lord Roberts, the commander of British forces in South Africa, said of the Canadians, "They were as good a lot of men as were in the British Army. Canadian now stands for bravery, dash, and courage." Major General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien said of the Canadians, "There are no finer troops, or more gallant troops, in all the world." The victory changed the British and the world's perception of Canada, as Canadian Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier said before the House of Commons of the victory of Paardeberg, "That day, the fact had been revealed to the world that a new power had arisen in the West. From 1901 to 1914, Canadians would gather in town squares and around memorials on February 27th to celebrate Paardeberg Day, which was a day to celebrate the Canadian Army's first major victory in an overseas war, to recognize those Canadians who had served in the Second Anglo-Boer War, and as an affirmation of English Canada's loyalty to the Empire. Those celebrations largely ended with the coming of the Great War and have been replaced with Remembrance Day, which is solemnly celebrated on November 11th, representing the date of the armistice in that war. From that first deployment of a truly Canadian unit, the Canadian Army has gone on to play vital and gallant roles in some of the most important and bloody conflicts in world history, through the World Wars, the Korean conflict, the Gulf War, and into UN peacekeeping operations in the war in Afghanistan in the 21st century. Approximately 118,000 Canadians have lost their lives in overseas wars. Today, the Royal Canadian Regiment is the senior regular force infantry regiment in the Canadian Army, still ready to fight to defend Canada and Canada's vital interests.
Now for the fun part, where I, the history guy himself, longtime friend of the history guy Brad Wagnon, and today, brother of the history guy Brad Geiger, talk about what might have happened if everything went differently. So today, we get to talk about something that I think is really unknown for a large part of the world. We get people who tell us, we tell all these pieces of forgotten history, and they're like, well, it's not forgotten here. And that's fair. But I think most people are not going to have heard of this, especially in the United States and for most of the world. This is a piece of history that is often forgotten, but was extremely important for South Africa. And I think there are some interesting ways that it could have gone
Canada and for the United Kingdom. Yeah,
that's true for both, because I think this could have been surprisingly impacted Canada, actually, for feeling like a minor conflict.
Yeah. So I did sort of a thought experiment at the start of this. If you ask what is the turning point of the Second Anglo-Boer War, it'll often go to Paardeburg. But if you just go to say, like, Google AI, and you say list me the top 50 turning points of the modern era, you aren't going to find Paardeberg on there. As a matter of fact, I just try to say that the top 50 decisive battles of the 20th century, we didn't find Paardeberg on there. So it's interesting, because I think we're going to find from here that it actually was a surprisingly important battle in terms of the wars to come. But it's certainly not on the list of ones that people think of. I mean, outside of the world wars, obviously, you get some stuff like Tsushima and stuff like that. But so I think people will be surprised to hear about this. I think it might be well known in Canada, because prior to Remembrance Day, which is their version of Veterans Day, they celebrated Paardeberg Day. And so I don't know to what extent it's well known in Canada. I know the Boer War would be more well known in the UK, but I think the rest of the world we don't really think of it. But this wasn't just one of Queen Victoria's little wars. This is, of all the colonial wars, I mean, this is by far the biggest, the bloodiest, and one that really did define both the British and the Canadian armies going into the First World War. So I just start off with that. I think if you didn't know about Paardeberg, you probably should.
Definitely. And just to put it in context, in 1898, South African gold production was 30% of the world's supply, if I'm not mistaken, 114 tons. So this definitely has the backdrop of the action that we're going to discuss is that you've got the world's number one gold producer on the line. And so this is not an unknown war in a little known corner of the world whose impact is insignificant.
If you know about this war, you probably saw Breaker Morant, is what I would say. I would say that's the primary way that most Americans might know about this war, which doesn't really give the context of the war. And of course, that's all. The war occurred in phases, and that was a phase that came after Paardeberg and the major battles, where that was the guerrilla part of the nasty, bloody Second Anglo-Boer War.
Yeah. The fact that the Boer War, the Second Anglo-Boer War, is often referred to as the first modern war, also gives us yet more context to reinforce the fact that this was an extremely important battle. Mm-hmm. And the war had follow-on consequences that resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, and introduced a lot of the Western world to asymmetric warfare.
Certainly, yeah. The asymmetric warfare in the latter part of the war certainly did. I mean, the main part of the war, which is the part we're talking about with Paardeberg, where you have two armies contesting with each other, trenches, barbed wire, land mines, aviation, combat aviation, the sorts of stuff you saw in the First World War. This is the first war that really shows these in an extent. And so, one of the important things about the Boer War is the way that it taught the British Army, particularly, what the war was going to look like. The British took huge losses because they hadn't understood that war changed. But those losses came in the Boer War and not during the Great War, and that's part of the importance of this otherwise, I think, kind of relatively lesser known conflict.
Well, and while Kitchener was not unknown as a general prior to the Boer War, his dominance of British military starts with the eventual victory in the Boer War, and then he becomes he's literally the poster child for World War One. I mean, he's the come serve with us. So this was also, like a lot of other regional conflicts, where the British officer corps had to learn about a lot of difficult things. And, the use of automatic weapons, the use of rapid firing rifles, all of that in a large scale. And also, they were fighting, to some extent, the Boer War proxy for the Germans.
Oh yeah, well, with rifles and good. I mean, they were fighting this at first like they were fighting, to say, the 1879 Zulu War, where their tactics were designed around you're fighting, brave dudes, but dudes mostly with spears, or up on the northwest frontier they had, some musketry. But I mean, here you're fighting people that have modern weapons and are really, really good with them, and that's very different. And of course, prior to this, the British officer corps was working on that idea that if you're a British gentleman, then you know how to be a British officer, and that's pretty much how we put you in control of things. And this is where we really start to professionalize the officer corps. Roberts, who eventually takes control of the war and actually eventually moves us to victory, moves the British to victory when he replaces Buller, was an incredibly professional soldier, to the point where he had learned how to do the Morse code, just in case on the off chance that everybody else in his headquarters was killed and he had to be running the telegraph. And he's a field marshal. So, I mean, this is when we're first, starting to see this truly professional officer corps. That came from some terrible lessons, which this is the timing of the Battle of Paardeberg is really, really interesting to the Boer War, because it had been a bad week for the British Army prior to Paardeberg. So, I mean, let's get to it, though. I mean, so the Canadians at Paardeberg, what was special about the Canadians at Paardeberg?
Well, I think it is, first of all, it's the fact that they're allowed to fight as Canadians. That because of some level of stubbornness, they are not incorporated into various British units. They are allowed to fight together. And that becomes kind of what happens throughout the next couple of wars. It's the Americans did it in World War I. No, we're not going to become part of the British Army. We're going to be our own army. But part of it is that they, first of all, they show a loyalty to a Commonwealth that has not always shown loyalty to them. But two, they fight with conspicuous gallantry, and in a way that's not expected. There was still, again, you talked about the British upper class being the British officer corps. There was a complete disdain for the colonials. And I think to some extent, the fact that the Canadians performed so well in the Boer War informed how other colonial troops were used in later wars.
Yeah,
and particularly Paardeberg, which was because this was as difficult a stand-up battle as you're ever going to have, and a few units would take the losses that the Royal Canadians took at Paardeberg and would come back the next day and fight again, which is what they did. Prior to Paardeberg, it's really, I mean, Canada didn't even really have nearly as powerfully, at least, a national identity. People across Canada didn't think of themselves as Canadians. They didn't think of themselves as British subjects in the same way that they did after Paardeberg. And certainly the Canadian Army, they were a very small defense force. And with the Constitution literally saying you can't send them outside the borders, they can only defend Canada. So the decision by Canada to participate in the Boer War is to me maybe the most significant part of the entire story here. So if you push the long-term story, what you will see is that Paardeberg is critical to the British victory in the Boer War. It was truly a turning point. and that the Royal Canadians were critical to the victory at Paardeburg. They were the ones that really shifted this particular battle. And that Paardeburg could be very, very important because coming at the end of the Black Week, the British public might have given up on this war were it not for this one victory. So if this is a key battle to winning the Battle of Paardeburg, to winning the Anglo-Boer War in the way that they did, which this makes this a key battle for defending the British Empire. But one of the things that means is, had they not won at Paardeburg, had they had to either negotiate a peace or if this war had carried on for another couple of years, there's a very good chance that the British are not in a position just 15 years later to be participating in the Great War, that they're distracted by empire or they're bankrupted by empire or they are still fighting in South Africa. And so this gets to a question, how different is the world if the British do not participate in the Great War?
Or at least are not prepared.
What if they just what if they're not worried about the continent because they're worried about the empire? And probably what the Germans, how quickly for the Germans to defeat both France and Russia in the Great War if it isn't for the BEF?
Yeah. I do think that it's highly unlikely that the British would ever have left South Africa. I think that they would have kept trying to break first the Boer. I hesitate to call them regular forces because it really was a militia, non-standing army. It was literally farmers, miners, and quite a few indigenous Africans who were trying to, who were trying to stop the British from coming in and taking, again, 30% of the world's coal supply. Mm-hmm. I do not see Queen Victoria saying, "Oh yeah, just give up on that gold."
Well, I mean, sort of, because the British government didn't want the war, right? And it was really Cecil Rhodes that pushed them into the war. This is a matter. I mean, because even though the Boer crossed the border first, it's truly a defensive war, and that they see this threat to Transvaal and the Orange Free State, and they're seeing that because Cecil Rhodes has this idea that we're going to take the entirety of East Africa, and then we'll have this empire that goes from South Africa all the way up to Egypt, the British government at the time was furious, really, at Rhodes for pushing them into this sort of conflict. So I feel like, and Chris, you can disagree. I feel like it's believable. It's very believable that we would have negotiated some sort of defense, saying or that the British would have been willing to negotiate to guarantee the security of Transvaal and Orange Free State, in exchange for anything, because that was really the point. The Boer were not trying to take South Africa. They were trying to get they did darn well at the sieges at Mafeking and Kimberley, but the Boer were really looking to guarantee their own free states, which of course they had. The Boer had been driven from South Africa when the British took it from the Dutch, and then they created their own states and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of context to this war, but there's always a point. And there was certainly a point in the American Revolution. There's certainly a point in the Civil War where the question was, is this too costly? And after the Black Week, I think the British were on the edge of that, and then comes Paardeburg. And the war suddenly looks winnable. So I think that there's at least a pretty reasonable argument to say that if it hadn't been for the victory at Paardeburg when that victory occurred, or if that had been just a much bloodier victory, it wasn't a bloody victory, but even if it had been a much bloodier victory, on the end of the Black Week, I think that there's a good chance the British public would have simply given up on this war, and the British would have had to have negotiated some peace. They did that in the first Anglo-Boer War, right?
Well, and there's a history of the British. I will settle for peace now. The British colonization is not one massive victory. There is a long history of we will settle this now. If they had lost Paardeburg, if it continued to go badly, the idea that the Boer go back over their border and everybody be nice, and then the British build up their army and come hunting you later, that's not only not unknown, that's actually their process.
It's kind of how they do things, yeah.
It's kind of how they did things.
So many of these colonial wars, what would happen is that they would suffer one defeat. And with their colonial troops, and then the British would get mad and they'd send a sledgehammer to swing it at a gnat, is how they put it. That happened in the Boer War, right? And the sledgehammer ran into a brick wall and was broken. I mean, they sent everybody, and they were losing battle after battle after battle to the Boer. I mean, if there's a point where you're at a breaking point in a war, right? I mean, the French were at that at the end of the First World War when the army was nearly at mutiny, right? But I think that this point, the end of the Black Week, is the point at which if this war was going to end with a different outcome, this is where that would be.
This
And
battle, it doesn't just decide the part of the war that is these pitched fights that they actually have, not guerrilla fighting, but actual forces in the field. This also devastates the morale. The much of the Boer forces, after they start moving out, lots of them don't come back to the field. They go home, they don't come back. And if they had managed a victory here, even if the British push on and we still get a guerrilla war, you're talking about I mean, something like 10% of the force of the total force that they had on the field surrendered here. Just those guys not being capable of being used in the field any place would have made a huge difference. I mean, I think what's so interesting about this battle, especially, is that it definitely could have gone differently. The British didn't want to stay. To be honest, Roberts and Kitchener had kind of decided that they had lost this fight. They were ready to pull out, and things just, both sides were ready to break, and ended up the Boers
the
broke
Royal
first.
Canadians,
But
the Royal Canadians,
right, that
literally that close.
there are times that the leaders are making decisions that the people up front then overwhelm. And in this case, it is in large part the fact that the Canadians had refused to retreat, the fact that they then came forward. And, there is plenty of military history where a general who's getting ready to retreat looks up and sees his people charging.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of
enemy retreating.
Yeah,
there
are plenty of times when you're looking to charge and you look up and here come your troops in your own direction, which is what happened to DeWitt.
Yeah, I think that actually happens more often. Yeah, I mean, and this battle was, to be fair about the Royal Canadians, this battle was really run by engineers. I mean, they figured out the strategy. It was to tunnel in the middle of the night, and then they could fight for trenches because, the first day the Royal Canadians tried just advancing and they get slaughtered, and the second day they are moving trenches forward, and the Boer realize that their position is untenable. So, I mean, part of the question, I guess, if we agree that Paardeberg was important, and that might have been the deciding point in this war, and then if you agree beyond that the Boer War could have impacted the Great War in numerous ways, that it goes to this question: how important were the Canadians, the Royal Canadians, to the Battle of Paardeberg? And I mean, that's a fair question, because there were something like 15,000 troops there, so the Royal Canadians were not a huge part of the force. But was their role unique? Or if they hadn't been there, would have just been another British regiment that did the same? It's a harder question.
I do believe, even though it's, I have not, I haven't run across anything in my research, but my suspicion is that the way in which the Canadians were trained and also the background of Canadians is significantly different than the British who were being sent over. So, much as American troops in World War II, World War One, and other involvements, but especially during the 20th century, were largely regarded as green, inexperienced, and incapable of being good professional soldiers. Time and time again, we see that American troops have a different level of ingenuity. Just because their training is different and because their backgrounds are different,
they bring a unique set of skills at Paardeberg, because you're not sure of them as a fighting force. They had several months essentially defending supply lines, and so they had some time to acclimate to this war in a way that a lot of the British, troops, recruits that were being sent in did not. So for being a relatively inexperienced unit, they had, more experience as a unit. I mean, that's interesting. We're the Canadians because they're Canadians, because we're scrappy North Americans who are used to tussling with Bigfoot. Were they persistent in a way that the British would not be? I don't know. I mean, you guys, I honestly think, I guess I'll I've been throwing out a lot of my stuff here, but I honestly think that the Battle of Paardeburg would have been won without the Canadians. In that the Boers were surrounded, they were wildly outnumbered, they were under the cover of artillery for much of the war. The Boer had an advantage in artillery. Here they certainly did not, and they were low on food. I mean, I think the siege was likely to wind up with their defeat. But if we just quickly, if we take where I was starting with was to say, if the Canadians were decisive in this battle, and this battle was decisive in the war, and this war was decisive in the British being prepared for and not distracted, and for participating in the Great War. If you don't have the British in the Great War, and the Germans win, I mean, what's the consequence there? And I think that's actually really interesting and worth discussing before going back to see, whether that's all in point, because there's some good scenario to say how the world might be way better off had the British not participated in the Great War and had the Germans quickly defeated Russia and France in the Great War. Among them being that it's unlikely that Nazism would have taken over Germany.
Yeah,
it is interesting to think how those that complex web of alliances would have worked out, because if England is busy with internal affairs or imperial affairs, maybe they were in their splendid isolation period here where they didn't have friends on the continent. If they just choose to maintain that concept, and so the stuff that goes on the conflict and on the continent, maybe that changes the entire calculations for who's allied with who.
Remember that the King of England and the Kaiser of Germany are first cousins.
Yeah, have you seen the pictures? They look like each other.
Right.
The Russians also are cousins in there too, right?
They're cousins to the Swedish king. Yeah. So I mean, I think if just say Paardeberg, they didn't win Paardeberg, and it means that the Boer War goes on another 2 years or another 4 years. That changes the propensity that the British are going to participate in this war, because the British, I mean, remember, the First World War is a redo of the Franco-Prussian War, where the British sat out.
Well, the French.
I think it's interesting to say, possibly it would not have been such a bad thing if the Germans had won the First World War, like they won the Franco-Prussian War, and the British had not stayed involved. I mean, it means all the stuff that comes in the wars after. I mean, there's no Second World War if there's no First World War. Right. When does decolonization occur? Because that's really a result of the Second World War. If the British are focusing on the colonies because of the Boer War, but it might mean that a lot of the radicalism that shifts in the 20s. Maybe we don't get Bolshevism in Russia. Maybe we get a peaceful transition to a more modern state. Maybe we never get Nazism rising or fascism rising in Italy, and I don't know what it means if Austro-Hungary takes the Balkans, but maybe all the conflicts that come from the Balkans later, maybe those are delayed or those are somewhat, to some extent, mitigated because we continue, can keep them all as a piece of an empire.
Well, do you hypothesize that France is completely defeated?
Yeah, I hypothesize that it goes for France about as well as it went in the Franco-Prussian War. Yeah, that's what I'm hypothesizing.
Yeah, but the Franco-Prussian War did not cause the end of France.
It didn't, and I don't think a Prussian victory would have caused the end of France. But I think if you look at the First World War, it's hard to imagine that France would have won that war against the Prussians were it not for the BEF as well, because the Germans very nearly beat them together. I mean,
Yeah. Well, the whole wheelwright and without the British stopping them and providing the line. Yeah, I think the eventual peace involves Germany taking another big chunk of France.
Mm-hmm.
If the wheelwright happens and France is gone immediately, there may not be a war on the Eastern Front. Russia may say,
Well, except that Germany wanted stuff over there that they might choose to push for. I mean, it would have been bad for a lot of people. It would have been bad for Belgium and Luxembourg and parts of France. And the Germans wanted to totally displace people in Poland and Latvia and places like that. I mean, so in some ways, those concepts would have been just as as racially bad as things that the Nazis did. Difficult to. I feel like part of the problem between World War I and World War II, and what had powered so many of these imperial wars, was the constant pushing for we have to have whatever's going to make us secure. That's why Germany starts this war, because they think that they can cripple France and secure border zones that will protect their core territory. It feels like if World War I goes very well for the Germans, we're still setting the scene for another European war. What that war looks like is an interesting question. Germany hoped to cripple France for at least decades. I don't know how that would have turned out. Sometimes we find that we want to cripple them for a long time, and they harder to cripple forces than they might hope.
I think that during one of our previous episodes, when we were discussing one of the conflicts of World War One, and what if the Germans win? There was a proposed post-war plan that was floating around Berlin, and essentially what it envisioned was a German superstate running from the Baltic. Oh yes, it was our Battle of the Baltic counterfactual. So basically, from Karelia all the way down through Ukraine to the Turkish border, Belarus, Poland. This would have been part of the German superstate, as well as a portion of France, and the proposal that was getting kicked around Berlin when they still thought that some sort of victory was possible, was that the French would pay crushing reparations. So,
sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, definitely. And as we saw, England did not enter World War One until Germany violated Belgian neutrality. So there was not a lot of appetite to somehow bring the Germans to heel during the Great War. And there were a lot of expectations, of course, the home before the leaves fall mentality. Both sides thought that this was going to be a quick war, and it turns out to be one of the deadliest, if not the deadliest, in human history.
Yeah, makes sense. Which is kind of what happened in the Boer War as well. I mean, though on a smaller scale, but I mean, still, no one expected it would be dragged out in the way that it was. There's also possibly, and I'm not really trying to advocate for Germany in the First World War. I'm just saying that if Britain doesn't involve in the First World War, it changes the century in ways that could, potentially be positive. You might not get some of the radicalization that comes over in Europe, that follows. But also, I mean, there's the threat that Germany felt. I mean, Germany saw their fight in the Great War as being a defensive war, right? They saw enemies on both sides. They were alienated. But if you don't have Britain in that mix, are France and Russia going to stand together, not knowing that Britain's not there? Is there a chance we simply don't get the Great War? If Britain is distracted and not participating on the continent, is there a chance that you don't get the diplomatic mix that causes, if you believe in that it was all the von Schlieffen plan and not the Potsdam plot or whatever, is there a chance that without Britain involved that we avoid the war altogether? And how does Europe evolve if they don't fight the Great War?
Yeah, Bismarck's famous formula: there are 5 great powers in Europe. Always make sure that you're part of the 3.
If one of
and
them
then Bismarck died, and it was up to the Kaiser, and things didn't go so well. So, yeah. But what if that goes
when
to
the Kaiser? Yeah, when the Kaiser drives the traditional enemies of France and England into a single block, he's accomplished something there, but it was not a positive accomplishment.
Well, but the whole idea of the von Schlieffen plan, which of course was bastardized and changed in the whole bit, was that we can defeat France before Britain can get involved. If you even have some sense in 1910 that there's British, say they're still tied down in Africa, say the failure of the British to knock down the Boers causes issues in, God forbid, India, which is always Britain's greatest fear. Something bad's going to happen in India, and they're going to notice that there's 750 million of them.
Yeah, number there, yeah.
At some point, the Indians are going to figure out this. Say that Paardeburg doesn't happen, that South Africa's a continuing fight, or they have to back off of it, and that gives some sort of power or thought process to some of the other colonies that you can fight. If in 1910 or 12, Germany makes the calculated decision that Britain, even if Britain wants to get involved, it can't. It is spread too thin. Then it doesn't have to build the fleet. Doesn't have to, because the fleet's not to stop the French.
Yeah. The fleet is
The,
about
the,
the British.
the fleet's about the British.
And
Germany
many
can,
see that naval war as being the cause of the First World War, the ultimate cause.
yeah. But Germany, if Germany's calculation is I'm fighting again, there are five great powers. What if once if I can say one of them's too distracted to get involved in time? Now it's me and Austria-Hungary against France and Russia, and that's a really different calculation.
Mm-hmm.
And so it doesn't require them to lose in South Africa. It requires them to get tied down in colonialism, which was
Mm-hmm.
always the problem. There's not enough British to run this many colonies. That's the reality of the situation. And Paardeberg is part of this British philosophy that if you allow revolution in one place, it will occur in other places, and they're not necessarily wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They've got an entire African empire they're trying to justify. They've got, as always, India.
Mm-hmm.
And if you lose India, none of the rest of this matters. South Africa may have have all the gold, but India is the jewel in the crown. Always, was right up until the moment it was not.
Yeah.
And South Africa has a large population of derived Indian citizens. So if Paardeberg doesn't happen, if Ben Wyke if he's even able to get away and delay that war, and Britain doesn't look like they're there to fight Germany, then they fight that war against France very differently.
It's a very different war. There's the other piece here is that there's a very good chance if the Boer War had dragged out that Britain would not have financially been in a position to fight the First World War, because they largely financed it, and their economy almost broke in the First World War. So if they'd been dragging out, and you're talking about but there's two colonies at this point that are independent, and the question is how much they're going to support Britain, and that's Australia and Canada. And the Boer War really decides that. I mean, the Boer War really decides that those two are going to continue to be military aid to Britain. And they could have decided differently. Mm-hmm. Or if the war had dragged on. So, I mean, here's another scenario. They win Paardeberg, but the Royal Canadian Regiment is devastated. The Royal Canadian Regiment is just torn to pieces, and like so many regiments were. And that is the second regiment ever made in Canada that would leave the country. Does Canada say we're not going to play in these wars anymore?
Yeah, and to put in context, in the First World War, over 600,000 Canadians enlist, and at least a part of that is driven by the fact that they do suddenly have, from Paardeberg, this military tradition. We have we have a crack elite unit that we as a nation can be proud of, and that ultimately is going to draw young people to say, hey, a career in the military, it's perhaps dangerous, but the excitement, the honor, the history, make me feel that this is a patriotic duty that they might not have had. Had there not been.
As well as a straight up infrastructure. I mean, it took a long time during the Boer War for the Canadians to figure out how do we even put together an army that can leave our borders. If they had been on that learning curve in the Great War, that significantly impacts Canadian participation in the Great War. Canadian participation in the Great War was extremely important. But I mean, what if Canada decides differently? What if Canada decides they talk it over and they say we're not going to do it? We want to have a defensive army. We don't want to go out and play out in the world, because there was a significant, movement in Canada for that. If the Royal Canadians aren't at Paardeberg, then does Canada participate in the Great War in the way that they did? And if the Australian army takes losses from another 2 years or 4 years,
the
of the
Australian
Boer War,
army.
Yeah, because there was, I mean, Australia almost went into revolt over a draft, right, during the First World War. So, I mean, a different Boer War might mean that Canada and Australia were both saying, this is not our war.
And without Anzac troops, Britain relied on so much of being able to pull forces out of the colonies, and that was, that was true across, but especially in World War I and World War II, there were huge numbers of those colonial troops. And I think you're right that there was a big movement in Canada against the concept of fighting this war. And if it would have been easy for the Canadians to be scapegoated for this battle, because I mean I think that's part of the reason why they were used as as these frontline troops. Kirchner kind of had a history of doing things of blaming someone below him for being the problem, and if the Canadians get scapegoated like that, get torn up in the press, that hurts their what the British think of them in terms of how useful the troops are, and what the Canadians think of how much the British respect them. And I think that might have been enough, and yet I think that Britain might have figured out in World War One and World War Two that they needed those troops.
Yeah, I think that is, to me, the biggest impact of the Battle of Paardeburg is it establishes Canada as a military force that is capable of extending beyond the borders. It convinces the people of Canada that they can do that. It creates a military that has a tradition to do that. If the Royal Canadians, even if they just stood in the back at Paardeburg and never distinguished themselves in the Boer War, or if they're devastated at Paardeburg, or if Kitchener scapegoats them at Paardeburg, if this turns out a way so that the elements in Canada that were anti-war, right, are the side that wins, then you don't get Canadian participation in the First and Second World Wars. And even if everything else happens the normal way, without Canadian participation in the First and Second World Wars, victory would not be assured.
Well, and Canadian troops go on to serve essentially throughout the 20th and 21st century.
Yeah.
They have become in every way a professional force. They are relied upon by the British up and to and in including Afghanistan.
Yeah, Afghanistan. Yeah.
So, if Canada makes a decision to be a purely defensive force, and particularly if that then leaves you want to know how easy it is to be isolated in Australia and say I don't care about the rest of the world.
Yeah.
I mean, Canada's at least got a border. Australia can just go.
Canada has the same reasons that the U.S. have to say we don't care. Canada has moats, right?
Right.
So that's the same way that we were isolationists. So that to me, that's incredibly
massive natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
Canada does not need to be involved in an international war for gas or oil or timber or metal or anything else. Everything they need to build their economy is sitting there, still relatively untouched at the time of the Boer War. And even so in World War One, they don't need to be bringing stuff in. They're not going to be quarantined. They can live their life exactly the way that they lived it prior to the war.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is purely national will that sends them to the Boer War. And it is in part that national will built by the Boer War that gets them sitting on the Somme.
Absolutely.
Fighting in Greece.
Yeah, in terms of national, I mean, the volunteers for the Boer War were primarily, from the English parts of Canada. The more French parts of Canada were against it, and so there's the idea that even Canada sees those two parts as being the same part largely came because of the attention that the Royal Canadians got at Paardeburg. They really established the Canadian military tradition. Prior to that, they had a teeny force. And like literally couldn't leave the borders. I mean, the only thing that would happen is if the U.S. decided to invade Canada, which I guess we didn't talk about that for another. Until the 21st century, still we started hearing that sort of buzz. But
well, I mean, the Canadians literally had not fought an external war since 1812, 1813.
Yes.
They had only fought among themselves against indigenous tribes, which wasn't a fight, which wasn't a battle. It was part of a continuing extermination of the native tribes. So they just, again, they didn't have an army.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't even have the idea that they needed an army.
And
until the British said, "Hey,
and
can you send some
they
folks?"
Get the idea that they needed an army because of the victory at Paardeburg. I think that the Canadian
100%.
Even if you say the British would have won Paardeburg without the Canadians, or even if you say the British would have won the Boer War without the Canadians, the Paardeburg, to me, the most important thing about Paardeburg is it establishes the Canadian military that is the military that makes such a difference in the First and Second World Wars.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, participates in Korea and the global war on terror and Iraq and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, before I forget this, we also have to remember that the Royal Canadian Regiment also played a key role in the Dieppe raid in 1942. Unfortunately, they had it at least as tough as they had it at Paardeburg. In fact, probably a little more so, because Dieppe was not Some consider it to be a necessary precursor to D-Day. Others look at it as a raid that was just it was unsuccessful and really had no meaningful impact on the war. And that's up for debate on another episode, perhaps. But yeah, they again. It is the Royal Canadian Regiment that gets tagged for the Dieppe raid. And obviously, they would not have been tagged unless there was some kind of a tradition there, and Canada had not demonstrated that. Yeah, this Royal Canadian Regiment. These are some bad people with guns that you may want to send on some of these dangerous missions.
Well, so and when you get to counterfactual on Paardeberg, that's the Royal Canadian Regiment.
Right. And how the U.S. became involved in World War I is incredibly complicated. There is no one precipitating factor like Pearl Harbor. But part of it is, and you can find this, I did go find some, part of the propaganda of the pro-involvement groups which were not the most popular, but still were there, was how are we not fighting when the Canadians are? There was a leadership idea that North America is already in the damn war. Okay, and certainly German submarines are probably more involved. The Zimmerman telegram is probably more involved. But the idea that, that little country up north that we always look down on, they're over there fighting in this war. Where are you? And there were Americans who volunteered to go to World War I with the Canadian troops, British and everything else. But there have been times that Canada has led the way. And the United States has looked. They did the same thing in World War II. And someday, I assume you've done a video on the astonishing participation of Canadians in World War II. 1.10% of the Canadian population. Yeah.
We've actually done.
The U.S., who's always a bit behind the times, there have always been some people who've looked and used the Canadian experience. And, Lance, I'm going to go back to something you said. I think at the Boer War, there was a difference in how the Canadians fought because the British were more professional, but they were also just, at some point, that small island nation got a little bit wore out. There are only so many troops you can send. There's only so long you can maintain morale. And yes, there's a value to the grizzled, you can think about the British grizzled warrior, guy who's fought in 12 different countries and that kind of stuff. He's going to fight a different way than those guys coming in from Canada trying to prove themselves. And there is a place for that kind of military.
And there were other colonials fighting as well. In the Boer War, though, the Canadian military was, there were, I think, 500,000 British troops there. And so the Canadian military was something less than 1% of the fight. But yeah, and that might be true at Paardeberg. We mentioned that before. Maybe the reason they're throwing the Canadians in front is because they still have fight in them. That after the Black Week and Modder River and stuff like that, the British were keeping their heads down. And that was certainly true in the Great War, is that, that there was one of the things that America contributed in the Great War, coming in late in the war, is that our troops were, willing to get out of the trenches in a way that everybody else had learned to duck over, 4 terrible years of war. So, that's fair. And so it leads, it's an interesting question to say, would the British have won at Paardeberg if it weren't for the Canadians? An interesting question to say, if the British had not won at Paardeberg, would they have continued the war? Would they have won the war? The general feeling is that the Canadians are a relatively small part of the force, and the British probably would have won anyway. But there's a good argument to say this was this was a regiment that turned a very important battle, that turned a war. And what does that mean? It means it might mean a lot, going forward. But still, it also comes down to this regiment. This regiment built the Canadian Army. This battle. Paardeberg is the one that said the Canadians are on par. And I'm not making that up. The British said that. The Canadians said that. The Canadian Prime Minister said that.
Yeah. And, flashing back to the fact that before Armistice Day, Canadians celebrated Paardeberg Day. That shows just how deep in the gut of the average Canadian the pride was.
Yeah. And then, it is illogical to take up a gun and go march against somebody else who also has a gun. There is no rationality to that. You to make men do that, and it's mostly men, but women, of course, requires something that is different than reason. And Paardeberg up until the horrors of World War I was that reason.
Yeah, especially since it was the second day for the Canadians. I mean, the first day they march down the hill and they are slaughtered. And they go back the second day. I mean, that takes some steel. It really does. And it's even difficult now to think, why did Canadians care? I mean, what did defeating the Boer really mean to Canada? It's not their war. And so that's part of what's necessary if you're going to have people that are going to take guns and march against an enemy.
One more thing about the Canadians is apparently they were the only ones who got the memo that the Boer had been quite successful by digging trenches and shooting at us from them, and up until that point, the British were focused on a different operational philosophy, and the Canadians recognized that, hey, they're doing pretty good behind heavy cover, so perhaps we should pull out pickaxes, shovels, what we have available that haven't been dropped on the march all the way.
It's amazing that it took Colenso and Magersfontein and the Black Week for the British to figure out that the way that they were fighting wars was not the way to fight wars.
I think what's incredible, one of the incredible things is they would have marched the second day. They would have charged this hill a second time if there wasn't almost a mutiny among the lower officers who said, this is idiotic. We just did that yesterday. And it kind of pushed Kitchener and Roberts into doing the artillery to bombarding them, because I think one more day of that would have meant the British backed out. I think they couldn't have done another slaughter against the defenses there.
Yeah, well, especially with the beating they were taking in the press over Black Week.
Yeah.
And you're right, bombarding. I mean, they weren't killing the Boer with bombardment, but they were destroying the morale. And I mean, if you went to war, those are your horses that are getting killed, the ones that you used to run your farm. So when you're sitting in a trench watching your entire farm getting blown up around you, that means, and your food supply too, I guess. But
yeah, which is fascinating because the Americans had learned that 60 years before, and then proceeded to forget the war. But Paardeberg, the trench warfare in Paardeberg, and then later in the Great War, that was Richmond. That was, this
was not actually
the Americans had already fought that war.
Trenches and barbed wire, and but I mean, landmines were very common in the where
landmines are news.
And there is a story where Baden-Powell buried dinner plates, and where the Boer could see them burying them because they didn't have landmines, but who could tell the difference? And were able to control huge parts of this front because they had buried their dinner plates. But this is and we did not use in any great extent machine guns in the Civil War, and that was one of the big differences here too. Is that that can make a huge difference having modern weaponry, but rapid fire artillery. There's all sorts of stuff that was used in the Boer War.
One more tangential. We have to say that without the Boer War unfolding the way it did, a certain young member of the nobility, one Winston Churchill, might have had a different career outcome than what he had. But after he escapes captivity, at that point, he enlists and he's in the war, and that serves to seal his reputation as someone who is willing to fight.
He kind of rises to heroism in this. I mean, he fought in a lot of wars. I mean, he was, but yes, he becomes quite important here in the Boer War. So the different outcome for the Boer War might mean a different outcome for Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, for sure. Yeah. And there's other officers here, that would make a difference. I mean, Roberts was really too old by the time the Great War started, but I mean, this is, were it not for the Boer War, we wouldn't have had the international scouting movement, right? I mean,
Baden-Powell,
literally derived from Baden-Powell in the Boer War, though not necessarily at Paardeberg. But there is an important question too: is that if when the Canadians were distracted, when their forces were there in South Africa, that would seem to be the point where it's most likely that Greater Sasquatchia could have uprisen and maybe attained territorial status. So that we might actually have the Sasquatch state. That would have been the moment when the Canadians were most vulnerable. So it's if they hadn't won at Paardeberg, might the Sasquatches have taken control of Canada?
How do we know that part of the Royal Canadian Regiment was not in fact made of Sasquatch?
That's good.
Maybe the engineers. The whole reason
That's another counterfactual, though, that's really kind of scary because Sasquatch is not an advantage in a trench war. And so let's say that the Sasquatch had decided to join with Canada in fighting the Boer War and the First World War. The extinction of the Sasquatch might have come because Sasquatches are on the whole taller than trenches.
That's fair. You're not going to dig. I mean, for a couple of guys digging it deeper. Yeah,
that's.
Yeah, the famous story of the French getting shorter after the Napoleonic Wars because all the tall ones got killed.
All the tall ones got killed in the First World War.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy
podcast.
I see
two Sasquatch scenarios.
We hope you enjoyed
really
this episode of Counterfactual History. And if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow the History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.
Or something like that becomes Greater Sasquatchia.
Well, Saskatchewan.
Saskatchewan,
Saskatchewan.
Yes, becomes Sasquatchewan.
Oh.
You teed it up. I couldn't resist.
Yeah, you could not prevent it there.